I saw that there was some overtime tax bill. So during the campaign for the 2024 election, the Trump administration or the Trump campaign came out and talked about removing the taxes for overtime work. Um, and as far as I understand, the Harris administration came on and said, okay, yeah, I guess we're sort of on board with that too. Um, it's one of those issues where on the surface, it seems like a good idea and like, oh, it seems like almost like a no-brainer. Like, why wouldn't we do something like that? But then when you start to think about it a bit more, I think it can become a problem. And where I've heard it described as a problem is that some ways that this bill is written, it doesn't like this bill doesn't narrow in on those working hourly jobs, right? So like when you think of overtime taxes on overtime, you're envisioning like a janitor or like a waitress or somebody who's doing like a low level, low paying, like hard job. And that they are, they're only getting 1.5 times their regular pay, and that, it would be nice if they could take home more of that. All of that is completely true. But my understanding is that some of the ways that these bills are written, it does not just include overtime hours after the 40-hour threshold for hourly employees, but it can also apply to salaried employees. Now, I don't think that's necessarily a problem, right? Salaried employees can have overtime too, and I don't think they should be any less eligible for this than an hourly employee. But then I think it also applies to bonuses and things of that nature. And that's where I think it starts to get really problematic, because it turns this bill from one that is directed towards the common man, towards the working class people, and it creates it so that the real bulk of the benefit goes towards like executives and CEOs that are receiving huge bonuses from their companies and won't have to pay any taxes on them. Right? It's nice if Joe Schmo working at the airport gets to keep home an extra $100 a month because his overtime pay isn't being taxed and they're shorthanded and he's having to work overtime multiple times a week. That's really nice. Okay, absolutely, and nobody would argue against that, or any reasonable person would argue against that. But if that also means that the CEOs who are receiving a $20 million bonus for basically tanking their company, or for just existing, basically, are now that isn't eligible to be taxed. I think that you would have to do the trade-off, right? That's a bad thing. That's definitely a bad thing. And so because that's tax money that should be going into the tax base but isn't, and is going into the pocket of a rich person who doesn't ostensibly doesn't need it. And so these things have to be weighed against each other, right? It's sort of like if you have a bill that on one hand feeds a poor child and on the other hand murders three poor children, it's probably not like it's not a good trade-off, right? Yeah, there's one good aspect of it and there's one bad aspect of it, but the bad aspect significantly outweighs the good aspect. And so it would be really stupid to do that. I have a feeling that the same dynamic is occurring here with this overtime tax bill. I'm hoping that this article gives me some more detail on boundaries of this bill, because if this bill is specifically targeted at those who are hourly based wage employees, all for it. And even if it's expanded to salaried employees, I'm all for it. But as soon as it starts to go into the bonus territory and we don't put some sort of cap on that bonus, I think that could be really problematic, and also morally problematic, practically and morally. The proposed no tax on overtime policy has sparked widespread interest among American workers, particularly those pulling double shifts, from nurses to factory workers clocking extra hours. The proposal to eliminate federal taxes on overtime pay promises to put more money in the pockets of hourly employees. But when does no tax on overtime start, and what does the bill pass date mean for you? Below, we answer every question about the overtime tax exemption bill, its current status, and its implications, including state-level developments and potential challenges. The proposed no tax on overtime bill is more than just a policy update. It serves as a potential lifeline for millions of Americans grinding through extra hours to make ends meet. As Congress debates, workers and employers alike await clarity on what does no tax on overtime start and how the date will reshape paychecks and American workplaces. The no tax on overtime bill aims to exempt overtime pay from federal income tax. Under the Fair Labor Standards Act, non-exempt workers earn at least 1.5 times their regular hourly rate for hours worked beyond 40 per week. As of today, this overtime pay is taxed like regular wages, subject to federal income tax, Social Security, and Medicare taxes. The overtime tax proposal, which is part of a broader $4.5 trillion tax cut package, aims to remove the federal income tax portion. This move will allow workers to keep more of their hard-earned overtime earnings. Payroll taxes, such as Social Security and Medicare, would likely still apply. Yeah, so that's what I was just about to say is where this would become a really, really, really serious problem, I think, is if it took away from, if you were exempt from having to pay the Social Security payroll tax. You should, even if they were to implement this rule, they should absolutely still require that income to be captured by the Social Security payroll tax. Um, we already have a serious problem where we're supposed to be over 90% of all income in the United States is supposed to be captured by the payroll tax. Right now, we're somewhere in the mid 80 percentile. And the delta between what it should be and what it is now is the difference between the solvency of the trust fund, the Social Security trust fund. And so it would be really problematic to implement this overtime tax bill and to exempt it from the Social Security tax, because then that's another couple percentage you can lop off of uh, the total income tax base that is captured by Social Security payroll tax. Another couple percentage would be lopped off, and then we'd be even further into the problem of the solvency of the trust fund. As of May 6th, 2025, the no tax on overtime start date has not yet been finalized. The proposal is still under review in Congress as part of a broader fiscal package tied to the 2025-2026 federal budget. If passed, the federal overtime tax exemption policy could take effect at the start of the new fiscal year, i.e., October 1st, 2025. The bill's final confirmation entirely depends on bipartisan agreement on the broader spending bill. Key updates on the current status of the tax exemption bill are expected over the summer legislative session. The overtime tax exemption would eliminate federal income taxes on overtime wages. In its current form, the proposal aims to increase take-home pay for hourly workers by exempting earnings beyond 40 hours per week from federal income tax. The overtime tax proposal does not affect Social Security or Medicare contributions, which will still be withheld. Good. Important. A specific bill, the Overtime Pay Tax Relief Act, introduced in January 2025 by Representative Don Bacon, proposes a partial deduction for overtime pay. However, the no tax on overtime bill status is currently classified as under consideration in both the House Ways and Means Committee and the Senate Finance Committee. The Senate version of the bill exists. No Senate version of the bill exists yet, which adds further uncertainty of the overtime tax legislation's timeline. Proponents of the bill argue it will stimulate productivity and offer major relief in an inflationary environment. However, critics warn it may end up straining $20 trillion out of federal revenues in the long term. Yeah, I mean, put aside, it would be really, really problematic if Social Security and Medicare taxes were exempt from this. But it is also still a bit less so, but also still problematic that this pulls from the general tax base. And if it is correct that it will, I wonder what it means by long term, because $20 trillion is a lot, and long term can mean a whole lot of different stuff. So if it means like over 1,000 years or 100 years or something, I don't really know what that means. But that is a very significant amount, and I would be fascinated to see what they mean by long term specifically. A final vote on the no tax on overtime policy is anticipated before the end of Q3 2025. For ongoing developments, refer to the Overtime Tax Relief Bill Update section of your state representative's website. All states with a state income tax, except Alabama, currently tax overtime pay as regular income unless new legislation passes. This includes high tax states like California, New York, and New Jersey, where workers face both federal and state taxes on overtime earnings. For instance, in Connecticut, state employees earned $305.4 million in overtime in recent years, all subject to state income tax. Proposed bills in states like Connecticut and Illinois could change this. However, as of May 2025, only Alabama offers relief. Check with your state's Department of Revenue for specifics on income tax policies. As of now, no state has independently passed a bill to align with the federal exemption, although some may follow suit if the national bill is enacted. You'll find the list of states with no tax on overtime below. Even though on the surface and in some practical ways, this is a pro worker, pro working class type of policy, I would argue that at its core, this is an inherently pro business owner, pro status quo policy because it further incentivizes people to work overtime. Low income, low on the social ladder who are earning an hourly based wage encourages them. And who disproportionately benefits from straining workers to do overtime? It's employers. And instead of having to pay for getting a new employee is expensive, right? Say you have a shortage of hours and you either have the option to go out and spend all the money it takes to search, train, hire, and onboard and yada, yada, yada. All it takes for a new employee. Oftentimes, those costs outweigh what it would be to just pay the 1.5 times overtime rate to your current employees and just strain them and ask or force them to work more hours. 40 hours is already a lot in the year 2025. I already think people should not have to work that much. And so this only further incentivizes people to be working beyond what I would hope people what I wish people would need to work in 2025, as well as it kind of strengthens the business owner's perspective and strengthens that dynamic where I said where it may be cheaper to just strain your employees and have them work more overtime than it is to actually go through the effort and cost and whatnot to hire an employee to fill in the gaps. It makes it so when you're an employer and you're in that scenario and you're choosing between hiring another employee and filling the gaps or squeezing your current employees with overtime, it's going to make you want to lean this ruling would make you want to lean more towards the overtime one. You're going to be less inclined to hire and properly do it the proper way and have your employees work a reasonable amount of hours. It's something I can't escape when I think about this policy. A few states have taken the lead on overtime tax exemption. As of May 5th, 2025, Alabama is the only state with an active overtime tax exemption. It came into effect on January 1st, 2024 under House Bill 217 and Act 2024-437. This policy exempts overtime pay from state income tax for full-time hourly workers exceeding 40 hours per week. The move has increased labor supply and personal earnings by roughly 5%. This exemption is set to expire on June 20th, 2025, unless it is extended. Oh, and as this article points out correctly, obviously states like Alaska, Florida, Nevada, New Hampshire, South Dakota, Tennessee, Texas, Washington, and Wyoming are states without official state income taxes. And because of that, this would not apply to them because their overtime pay is already not taxed by a state income tax. The no tax on overtime bill's effective date depends on when Congress passes and the president signs the bill. If approved by mid-2025, the exemption could start as early as July 1st, 2025 for the fiscal year. A more likely scenario, given legislative delays, is January 1st, 2026, and aligning with the tax year. Even if signed into law, payroll systems may need to adjust, so workers might not see changes in paychecks until early 2026. For American workers, the no tax on overtime start date could mean significantly higher take-home pay. An hourly worker earning $20 per hour would see their overtime rate of $30 per hour taxed only Social Security and Medicare, and thus increasing net earnings. This policy may end up incentivizing more overtime, especially for frontline workers such as firefighters, nurses, and retail staff. As for employers, the no tax on overtime policy arrives as a double-edged sword. Tax-free overtime may reduce hiring needs by encouraging existing staff to work extra hours. However, this could also strain budgets if demand for overtime increases. How could it strain budget? You're a business owner. Your whole job is to weigh the benefits and costs between the two options, between straining your current employees through overtime or hiring more to fill in the gaps that exist. Um, However, this could also strain budgets if demand for overtime increases. This could also strain budgets. If it strains the budget, that's because you've done something wrong. You've fucked up as a business owner. Like that's not no. No, it's not a double-edged sword. It's a single-edged sword. This is only a good thing for them. What do you mean it's a double-edged sword? You're trying to sound objective here, but it's not. It's just stupid. It's a single-edged sword, not double. Be very clear about that. Tax policy on overtime represents a single shift in how compensation is treated under federal tax law. Unlike tax credits or deductions, this proposal aims to change with the withholding structure. It would provide workers more in each paycheck rather than waiting for tax refunds. The bill also raises questions about fairness and implementation. Would salaried workers eventually be included? What about those with multiple jobs? Yeah, it's a good point. Salaried people, I would think, are no less deserving of this. All right. My laptop battery died mid-article, so let's finish this one midnight style. These discussions are ongoing. There are several pros and cons of the no tax on overtime bill. You'll find a detailed list for each below. Pros of the no tax overtime bill: worker benefits, more take home pay for hourly workers. This would reward hard work and boost disposable income. By a really small amount, I guess, sure. Economic stimulus: increased worker spending could drive demand for goods and services and thus support local economies. What they're not accounting for in this economic stimulus pro part of the argument is the money that it takes away from the government's the general tax pool, and to the extent that the government's policies are economically stimulus, right? Some of these government policies, some of those tax dollars being spent would be spent on programs that are necessarily economically stimulant. So it doesn't really make sense that you're going to argue that putting more money in the pockets of these workers is economically stimulant when the alternative is just as potentially more economically stimulant as putting the money back in the workers' pockets. So it's a weird argument. I don't feel like the economic stimulus pro of this really is even a pro. It's just a nothing. It's just describing reality. And labor market flexibility. Employers may attract and retain workers more easily, especially in labor shortage industries. I don't even know. I don't like how they've worded this labor market flexibility pro. Employers may attract and retain workers more easily, especially in labor shortage industries. No, I feel like they're going to utilize their current workers more by what I described earlier, by leaning more towards using overtime pay as a way to fill in the gaps as opposed to hiring, training, onboarding a whole new employee. Attract and retain workers more easily just because you're offering them more money. I feel like that's a sign of desperation more than anything, right? And cons of the no tax on overtime bill. Revenue loss. According to the Tax Foundation, a federal exemption could reduce revenue by $680 billion to $1.5 trillion over a decade. This may end up straining Social Security and Medicare. Yeah, if it's really that much. So wait, $680 billion over a decade. So that would be 68. Wait, that would be $680 million a year. Are they saying this could lose us between 680 and $1.5 billion a year? That seems So wait, is all of that really worth putting an extra 2% or 3% or whatever the percentage would be extra money in the pockets of working class people? Is it really worth cutting the tax base by that much? I would really question that. Tax fairness: salaried workers, often ineligible for overtime pay, may feel disadvantaged. High earners could exploit loopholes, which may end up reclassifying pay as overtime. Yeah, this is probably where my biggest problem with all of it is I worry how they're going to word this bill, and that some wordings of some of the bills I've seen include like bonuses, and that really it's a big boondoggle for the CEOs to get their bonuses and whatnot and their golden parachutes to be tax exempt. And complexity. The policy could complicate tax codes. If that happens, it may end up increasing compliance costs for employers and the IRS. The no tax on overtime bill status is plagued by controversies. Supporters argue it rewards hardworking Americans and incentivizes labor in a tight market. Critics like the Economic Policy Institute warn that it could encourage excessive hours, harm worker health, and exacerbate inequalities for those unable to work overtime due to caregiving or health constraints. The Tax Foundation argues that workers may favor overtime eligible jobs over salaried roles, which may potentially distort labor markets. Furthermore, the significant revenue loss raises concerns about funding for social programs such as Medicaid. All of those, this is the most salient, important paragraph of this entire article. I'm going to reread this whole thing because it's so important. The no tax on overtime bill status is plagued by controversies. Supporters argue it rewards hardworking Americans and incentivizes labor in a tight market. Critics like the Economic Policy Institute warn that it could encourage excessive hours, harm worker health, and exacerbate inequalities for those unable to work overtime due to caregiving or health constraints. So those are two issues I talked about earlier, that it could harm workers by, instead of doing the proper thing as an employer and filling in the gaps with a new employee, you're going to strain your current workers by forcing or strong arming them into doing overtime. That's a problem. There's a worker health problem. But then, as something I didn't even talk about, and this is very true, is the inequality aspect to this. Is a mother who's working full time but doesn't have the ability to go past 40 hours less deserving of that bit extra money that you're going to put in your pocket than the single guy who's able to do 55 hours and is able to say yes to the extra 15 hours a week of overtime pay their employer is asking of them? Is that mother is contributing to the business in the time that she's there theoretically just as much as the guy is. And so in that sense, she should theoretically, you know, any bonus that this guy receives due to us changing legislation and the way that taxes are done, she should be eligible to a similar benefit. I mean, if we're going to be fair about all of this. The Tax Foundation argues that workers may favor overtime eligible jobs over salaried roles, which may potentially distort labor markets. Furthermore, the significant revenue loss raises concerns about funding for social programs such as Medicaid. This is 100% right. That I wonder to what extent, because like, how much does this actually change the salary equation, right? If you would have made $70,000 a year working overtime without this bill, doing an extra, say, 5 hours a week of overtime for your employer every week, how much extra are you going to get in your pocket, like over the whole year as a result of doing this? I would imagine it's pretty small, and I would imagine unless you're doing a whole lot of overtime, that the effect that this is going to have is almost insignificant. So yeah, the article, strangely written article, but it does address some of the real concerns about this. And that I don't think this is a clear black and white issue, that this is a clearly good, obviously correct thing, and that anybody who would be against this bill or something similar to it is acting in bad faith or whatever. I think how this is implemented is extremely important, as well as it not being a clear black and white, obvious good thing. There are some potential negatives to this. There are some explicit negatives to this, like pulling from the general tax pool, and then there are potential negatives to this, like pulling from Social Security or Medicare, or allowing CEOs to have their bonuses exempt. All of these, depending on how the bill is written, could potentially be problems with it.